Welcome to week 1 of our course. I look forward to working with you during this unit. During this week, we will be exploring the impact of the Second World War on the United States and beyond. For this week, you are asked to read one chapter from your textbook. The assigned chapter is Chapter 27, America and the World. This chapter deals with the events leading up to the Second World War, the Second World War itself, and focuses on America's role in the war. The Second World War was the largest conflict in world history. It took place from 1939 to 1945, and the United States was involved directly in the war from 1941 to 1945. The United States became involved in the Second World War after the Empire of Japan launched a surprise attack against the United States. This was the bombing of Pearl Harbor. In December of 1941, on an early Sunday morning, Japanese aircraft bombed the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, killing over 2,400 Americans, primarily sailors in the Navy. This shocking attack led America, the United States, to declare war against the Empire of Japan. Subsequently, Nazi Germany, who was an ally of Japan, declared war against the United States. And the United States became involved in both theaters of the war. The United States would fight against Nazi Germany in Europe and against Imperial Japan in Asia. The United States would make great contributions to the Allied victories in both Europe and in Asia, in defeating both Germany and Japan. And in this unit, you will be exploring aspects of each conflict. One assignment for this unit is the discussion board. The discussion board for this week asks you to consider the internment of Japanese Americans. This was one of the most tragic aspects of America's involvement in the Second World War. As I noted, America became involved in the war in response to a shocking attack by the Japanese Empire. Unfortunately, this led to extreme hostility towards Japan and Japanese Americans, and it led to the policy of the internment camps. It's important to note that Japanese Americans had nothing to do with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Many Japanese had immigrated to the United States over the preceding half-century. Most settled along the west coast, not surprisingly. The key port of entry for Japanese immigrating to the United States was Angel Island and the port off San Francisco Bay. And there had always been some racial hostility towards Japanese Americans. Racism was very prevalent and a very powerful force in America, really throughout American history, and racism was still very strong in the 1940s. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, there was tremendous hostility expressed by many Americans towards Japanese Americans. The Japanese American community included many citizens. Anyone born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. This was established by the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So all of the Japanese Americans who had been born in the country were by definition citizens of the United States. Yet during World War II, Japanese Americans weren't really treated as equal citizens. Due to the rising hostility against Japan and Japanese Americans, they faced tremendous persecution and unfair treatment. It was President Franklin Roosevelt who ordered the internment, or essentially imprisonment, of Japanese Americans during the war. This was based on the advice of his military advisors. The leadership of the military urged President Roosevelt to issue an executive order calling for the imprisonment and relocation of Japanese Americans. Any Japanese American who lived close to the West Coast was ordered to report for quote-unquote relocation. Essentially, Japanese Americans were bussed hundreds of miles away from the coast into the interior of the United States and imprisoned in makeshift camps, internment camps. These camps were quickly set up. The living quarters were essentially barracks with cots. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire and patrolled by guards, by military personnel, and the Japanese Americans who were relocated there were not permitted to leave. So it was essentially a prison camp. Japanese Americans, men, women, children, young people, older people, were all ordered to relocate to these camps. The justification for this was the fear that Japanese Americans might be loyal to Japan and might launch sabotage attacks against US forces or American factories on the West Coast. Essentially, there was a fear that Japanese Americans would support the Japanese Empire during World War II and do so by attacking installations along the coast. There doesn't really seem to be any legitimate basis for this fear. During World War II, there was not a single example of Japanese Americans attacking the United States. So there really was no foundation in reality for this fear. And the order of internment, most scholars today would agree, was unjust. One individual did challenge the order of internment. This was an individual by the name of Fred Korematsu, and Fred Korematsu was an American citizen of Japanese ancestry. He refused to show up at the relocation for his relocation and was arrested as a result. He challenged the constitutionality of the law. He argued that the law violated his constitutional rights. All Americans enjoy certain constitutional liberties, and he argued that this imprisonment was a violation of that. He had not been accused of any crime, he had not been convicted of any crime, and he did not see why he should be imprisoned simply because of his Japanese ancestry. Unfortunately, the court would rule against Fred Korematsu. The Supreme Court of the United States would rule that in a time of crisis and emergency, such as a war, the United States government has the power to imprison an element of the population to protect the security of the United States. Basically, the Supreme Court ruled that the security of the United States as a whole was more important than the individual rights of each citizen. Essentially, that national security trumped individual rights during wartime. Of course, this was not the first time that individual rights had been trampled upon during time of war. Often during times of war, the government takes actions that limit individual freedom. During the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln suspended the right of habeas corpus and ordered the imprisonment of anyone who supported the Confederacy in Maryland due to fear of insurrection. Many scholars argue that this was a violation of individual liberties. Of course, during the recent global war on terror, surveillance was expanded. The government was granted greater power to investigate Americans' emails, telephone calls, etc., and some argue that this is a violation of individual rights. The second issue that you're exploring this week comes from the focus essay assignment. During World War II, Nazi Germany sought to murder the entire Jewish population of Europe. During World War II, approximately 12 million Jews lived in Europe, in many different countries. The Nazis were extremely anti-Semitic and wanted to eliminate the entire Jewish population of Europe, and set out to do so. Starting in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, German forces began executing large numbers of Jews. At first, this was done through mass shootings. When the German army invaded Poland, a group known as the SS, the Einsatzgruppen SS, moved in behind the German army, and these SS troops would move from town to town, rounding up the local Jewish population, forcing them to march into the surrounding rural countryside, forcing the Jews to dig massive pits, and then the SS would shoot all of the Jews, men, women, and children, and dump their bodies into mass graves. Subsequently, in 1941, the Nazis ordered the construction of death camps. These were industrial killing centers, which housed large-scale gas chambers and crematoria. Millions of Jews from across Europe were deported to these death camps and were murdered. Jews were sent to gas chambers, murdered, and then their bodies were burned in the crematorium. It's estimated that during World War II, during the Holocaust, somewhere between 5.5 million and 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis, roughly half of the Jewish population of Europe. The United States government was aware that this was going on. Certainly by 1942, Franklin Roosevelt and the leadership of the United States government learned of the mass killing of Jews in Europe. And by 1943, this was reported in American newspapers as well. There was much debate over what to do about this. As you'll see in the focus essay that you've been assigned to read from your textbook, some suggested that the United States government should order the bombing of the concentration and death camps to try to disrupt the killing process. Others argued against this. Some military leaders noted that the bombs of that era were not precise. There was no way to bomb the gas chambers without hitting the surrounding barracks in which the prisoners lived, and that bombing the camps could actually expedite the death of the prisoners. Others argued that this would divert resources from the broader war effort against Germany. Some argued that the only way to end the mass killing of the Jewish population of Europe was to defeat Nazi Germany, and that all military assets should be devoted to that task and should not be used towards bombing the camps. Ultimately, President Franklin Roosevelt decided not to order the bombing of the camps. American military forces and Soviet military forces liberated the concentration and death camps during the Second World War, largely in 1945, towards the end of the war. The Soviet army liberated the large death camps in the east, like Auschwitz. American forces liberated typically the somewhat smaller but equally horrific concentration camps in Western Europe, particularly in Germany. American soldiers were stunned at what they found. They had heard that the Germans were killing Jews. It was one thing to hear about this and another to actually witness the horror of the camps. American forces liberated concentration camps in Germany and found gas chambers, found crematoria, discovered huge heaps of bodies, of corpses, of individuals who had either been gassed or who had simply starved to death in the camps, and were horrified by this. President Dwight Eisenhower ordered that all American soldiers in the area of the camps should go through the camps to witness what he had seen as well. And Eisenhower suggested that this demonstrated why the war was necessary, General Dwight Eisenhower, that we were fighting this war to end atrocities like the Holocaust. You are asked to answer 2 questions related to this focus essay that appears in your textbook. So your assignments for this week are to participate in the discussion board related to Japanese internment, and to answer the questions related to the focus essay on the Holocaust. I hope that you'll find this to be an interesting unit. I do look forward to working with you. Thank you.